I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
Okay, so just to begin, the reason I got into this topic and what interested me first was Alex Jones.
Yeah.
Alex Jones rant about gay frogs, which is very easy to see and just think it's insane and dismiss outright. But, and I'm not saying that there are, gay frogs necessarily, but clearly atrazine is an endocrine disruptor. Clearly, it has feminizing effects, but it's really difficult to find that out. So, I guess to begin, when do you remember the first time you saw the Alex Jones rant, and did you know it was connected to you?
I can't remember. I think somebody sent it to me, or there was a meme or something that maybe a student in the class sent to me. Might have been 2 or 3 years ago. I don't remember. I think it was a student in a class that I was teaching pointed out, oh, have you seen this? And emailed it to me. And yeah, I knew it was related. My work and that controversy had sort of leaked into popular media in many different ways. New York Style magazine, for example, made comments. David Letterman has made comments about my work and stuff. So it didn't surprise me.
Do you think that helped or maybe hurt your case, having Alex Jones rant about it and make it seem like really nonsensical?
Well, it's actually been suggested to me, talk about conspiracy theories, it's actually been suggested that that idea and that story was planted with him to do just that. So it's not the first time I've heard that it was actually planted for him as another way of trying to discredit my work and discredit the field.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. And yeah, and I've seen, and I've kind of, the thought did occur to me, and a lot of people suggest that in the comments of the video. When it comes to atrazine and specifically hermaphroditism, can you just list out the studies that show that in amphibians, when you expose them to atrazine at any dose, it doesn't matter. Can you just list studies that echo your findings?
So specifically work on amphibians. There's a group in Florida, I think Lou Gillette was one of the co-authors, that showed that atrazine had feminizing effect on amphibians. There's a group in Canada, Trudeau, I think, is a co-author there that showed that atrazine had feminizing effects or demasculinizing effects on amphibians. There's my work. There's actually the company's work. So the original work that Jim Carr and those guys put out, if you look at the data, they actually show a greater percentage and a statistically significant number of exposed animals that developed as hermaphrodites. I mean, it's in their very own paper. Even though they say they didn't repeat it, it's published. Their data is showing the suppression of testosterone, again, in their own work that Syngenta's published. Where else has it come out? And there's multiple studies in fish showing a decline in testosterone and an increase in estrogen. In fact, a study by the U.S. Geological Survey just came out a few months ago showing that the effects of atrazine in fish are carried on for 3 or 4 generations after the exposure.
I'm familiar with one study in particular that found at the same really low ecologically relevant levels. There was a study done on fathead minnows. Can you talk about that?
I don't. Which fathead minnow study are you talking about?
Oh, I'm gonna have to look it up here.
I don't have it off the top of my. I mean, like I said, there is a study from the USGS, from a group that did work in. Anyway, I can't remember where they are, but that shows the multi-generational work. You'd have to tell me whose study you're talking about, and I don't know if I had the details off the top of my head.
Tillett,
yeah, that's the USGS, that's the U.S. Geological Survey study. So that's a study that showed feminizing effects on fish, and then a more recent paper shows that 3 or 4 generations down the road, you still see impacts on gene expression in those fish after they were exposed. Yeah, that's Don Tillett.
So, with your study, it seems like, from what I can tell, that not many people found these effects at such low doses. Would you say that's true?
No, that's not true. Jim Carr, working under Syngenta, like, as I said, if you read their paper, and I've reviewed their paper in another paper of mine in Biosciences, if you look at their paper, they found hermaphrodites at statistically significant levels down at those same low doses. It's Carr et al. I don't remember. It came out about a year after my initial paper. So they've shown it for sure.
What do you think? Do you think the controversy was only generated by Syngenta's pushback, or do you think that the science is somewhat mixed for this topic?
I don't think the science is mixed at all. I mean, I've given talks where I've shown that the only studies that suggest that atrazine has no effect are all funded by Syngenta. There are no published independent science studies that suggest that atrazine has no effect, except those funded by the industry. That's just a fact.
Can you tell me about the 2007 EPA risk assessment and the two studies that Syngenta funded, and I think it's CLOAS.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about the EPA's determination, how they pretty much used that one study to say that atrazine has no effects to amphibian gonadal development, and how did they reach that conclusion?
Well, I mean, I think you got it right in your documentary. So I've known CLOAS we were graduate students at the same time, and he's always been, sort of a rival, or we always worked in sort of similar areas, and I don't know if Syngenta knew that, but the first red flag should be that at the time that Klaus Werner was recruited by Syngenta, he was on the EPA panel. Okay, so when I presented to the EPA panel, Klaus was one of the people who was supposed to be judging the work, who was supposed to be an independent consultant to the EPA on the advisory panel. And at that time, Syngenta was already courting him and other members of the panel with the payoff. And so the conclusion of the original EPA panel that there wasn't enough data and more studies need to be done, that conclusion was to the benefit of Klaus. So it was to his benefit to say, oh, more studies need to be done. And by the way, Syngenta is already whispering in his ear, we have millions of dollars for you to do it. And if you look at that published work, it was essentially a collaboration between the EPA and between Syngenta. So Alan Hauserman was involved in that study. Tom Steger with the EPA was involved in designing and setting up that study. And the idea was for us to make a state-of-the-art design and to say, this is the only kind of study that we're going to accept, and to do that in such a way that no independent academic scientist could repeat it. No academic scientists working in this area could afford this apparatus that does the water mixing and the atrazine mixing and the kind of massive histological analysis that they did. So essentially what they did is they said, well, these are the rules, these are the studies that we'll accept through this collaboration between Syngenta and the EPA, and no other study. So it made Syngenta's job easy, once a few $1 million for them. It made the EPA's job easy because they said, oh, there are no other studies that meet this criteria that we've set up. And they know that there wouldn't be any more competition for it because, like I said, there's no independent lab that could afford to do that kind of work. And it's not that it was better work. It was really done in a way as to exclude all other work. What's more is, and I suspect this is why they're making new videos and documentaries, what's more is it's now known that the source of frogs that they work with are incredibly resistant to not just atrazine, but to estrogen. The frogs that they work with don't even respond to estrogen.
African clod frog.
African clod frogs, but they're using a source that doesn't even respond to estrogen.
So yeah, the scientific advisory panel, they advised them to use multiple species of amphibians, and yeah, the EPA didn't go ahead with that. But also, because it seems like they didn't do an exact replication of your study. Instead of using static renewal, they used what was it, glass? What was the term again? Can you help me out here?
I know what you're talking about. It's a recirculating system that feeds in the solution continuously. So the water is changed over time rather than static renewal. And again, it's an apparatus that they designed that there's no way any independent scientist could replicate or do that. And that was intentional.
They, in that study, they exposed the amphibians to even I think it was 100 micrograms per liter, and they still said there's no effects.
That source of animals that they used don't even respond to estrogen, so of course there's no effect. And I suspect that's why they're back on it again, because they know that fact is about to be published.
They just did the EPA just did a risk assessment in September. Do you know the details of that? Anything that you can share about that?
I don't. I only know of their last report, which finally, after 2 decades, admitted that atrazine was a reproductive toxin and a potential threat to terrestrial and aquatic life. That came out a couple of years ago.
That was 2016. And they do you know why they only released them as drafts rather than after 2007? It seems like every time that they look at this issue, the EPA, it's released as unofficial drafts, basically, rather than putting out like a final conclusion like they did in 2007. Is that because they just
there might be some legal or some policy related? Maybe if it's a draft, it allows them to pull back and change their mind. I have no idea. I don't know that. There's some semantic. I'm sure there's a legal reason why they do that, but I don't know the answer.
Yeah, it's strange. There was one EPA official that you mentioned, I think in 2003, and he worked on the eco risk panel at the same time that he was working on the EPA. And
you're talking about Ron Kendall?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I saw one time in one of your talks, you just showed just a series of conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
And can you tell me about Ron?
So I met Ron Kendall because he was the owner or the founder and CEO of this company, EcoRisk. He and the guy's name escaping me now. But anyway, he was also the chair of the scientific advisory panel of the atrazine risk assessment panel that I was hired as a consultant on. And he was simultaneously at that time, even though he had a private company that was contracted and working for Syngenta, he at that time was also running a research facility at Clemson University that later moved to Texas Tech. And at the same time, he was also the chair of the scientific advisory panel to the EPA. He was a member of something called EDSTAC, the endocrine disruptor screening and testing committee or something like that for EPA. And at the time, he was also either president or vice president of the Society for Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. And at the time, he was the chief editor of the journal Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. And so it's funny that they like to talk about my PNAS paper and it wasn't reviewed, when I happen to know that every single paper that they submitted was rejected for publication. I know that for a fact because I was the reviewer. Mm-hmm. In fact, my son, who was about 12 years old at the time, one of their studies was so bad that I gave it to my 12-year-old son, and my 12-year-old son wrote the review that got it rejected. And all of that work was then published in the journal that he was the editor of, even though it was rejected either from that same journal or from other journals. Mm. So incredible conflicts of interest that he was working for the EPA, he was working for Syngenta, he was in an academic institution running the labs, and he was the president and editor of the major journal Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry.
Can you tell me about Ann Lindsay, who made a statement in 2005, pretty much saying that they didn't see your data?
I've never met Ann Lindsay. I only know of her testimony, and when she presented to, that was a testimony to the Minnesota State Legislature. I wasn't allowed in. It was a session that was closed to me, so I wasn't allowed in when she presented. I was allowed to present the next day after she was gone, and subsequent to her providing testimony, I became aware that she dishonestly said that she never received my raw data. I have, as I said, Mary Frankenberry and Tom Steger were in my lab as we collected the data. Syngenta had access to all of my raw data that they turned over to the EPA. Syngenta owned it. And I provided all of my raw data to the EPA. As you saw, that was acknowledged in a letter and in an email by Tom Steger that they had all the raw.
You sent me the emails.
So. Yeah. And I subsequently learned from the documents that came out in the court case that Ann Lindsay's testimony was written by Syngenta. So there are notes, as you know, there's handwritten notes from Syngenta asking, does Ann Lindsay have her testimony? Is she ready to talk to reporters? So I don't know how they paid her off, but clearly she was under their control when she provided that testimony.
At the time in 2003, right before that risk assessment, how new was the field of endocrine disruptors, and because the EPA at the time didn't have their own testing to look into it, and from what I understand, that they were looking for like linear dose responses, and with EDCs they can have U-shaped dose responses, so at high and low doses. Can you just tell me about like how what the stage was for that back then and compared to now?
Well, I think for me, it wasn't new at all. So as an endocrinologist, as somebody who studies hormones, we're well aware of things like the inverse U curve that you just mentioned. So for example, it's very clear that estrogen makes you fertile, that as a human, if you have no estrogen, you're infertile, that you need estrogen to be fertile, but too much estrogen has the opposite effect. That's how birth control pill works, right? Birth control pill is an extra big dose of estrogen and progesterone, which actually prevents your body from making its own and developing. So low doses increase fertility, high doses have the exact opposite effect. So, and what we consider low doses in endocrinology, what's considered a low dose in toxicology is not a low dose in endocrinology at all. So we're talking about 0.1 parts per billion atrazine being effective. Estrogen's effective at levels 100 times lower than that. So to an endocrinologist, it's not a low dose effect at all. And for a dose response to be nonlinear is not a surprise to an endocrinologist at all. It was starting to become a big deal because people outside of endocrinology were starting to be aware. For example, probably the best example or easiest example here is birth control pill. As I said, we already know that it's really active at low doses, and birth control pill is designed so that it's not metabolized so quickly. It stays in your body longer. And as an endocrinologist, it starts to become clear that, okay, well, eventually it leaves your body, and where does it go? It goes down the toilet, means it ends up in wastewater, means it ends up in reclaimed water, means that it's potentially a problem in the environment. So it wasn't anything new to endocrinologists at all. And I think the danger and the threat was one of the reasons that I clashed with this panel was because that knowledge and that information and how to design those kinds of studies were already within the realm of endocrinology, of people like me, that classic toxicologists felt a little threatened, right? So you have this group of people like Ron Kendall and John Giese and these guys who are being supported by industry because they know how to figure out if a chemical is toxic. And now you turn around and ask, we're saying, we don't care about the doses that are killing things. We don't care about the doses that are carcinogenic or teratogenic acutely. We're talking about doses that, this level that I'm looking at is 1,000 times lower than what you said was safe based on toxicology. So to toxicologists, to classic toxicologists, this was all a new science. And you'll hear, if you look at Ron Kendall's testimonies and talks and things, he'll talk about how this is a new science and an emerging science. No, this is what endocrinologists have been studying for 100 years. And I think that was another part of the threat was they weren't really the experts.
So, do regulatory agencies like the EPA even have a function? Do they work? Because it just seems like, especially in this case, and then I look at bisphenol A, how the FDA threw out studies in a very similar way to what they did in 2007 with atrazine. It just seems like you can't. What institution are you supposed to trust?
I was so naive when I got involved in all of this. And, when I first got the data on the frogs, on the larynx, those are the first data I got. I, believe it or not, I was actually excited. I thought, oh, the company's going to be happy to hear this. Because my thought was, if I had a product and I were a company, I'd want to know that it had this potentially dangerous or negative side effect, rather than keep selling it and putting out into the environment. And the same, when I first got involved with the EPA, I thought, oh, they're gonna love my data. Like, this is gonna be really helpful and useful. And the problem is the two are so intertwined with each other and so beholden to finances. And as somebody in the local EPA here in California once said to me, is, well, think about it. The upper administration of the EPA, those are political positions. Those are appointed positions, and the people who appoint them have people that they have to answer to, and if this finding is potentially going to cost them money, then they don't want to hear it.
One of the last EPA administrator, when I was researching this topic, I read an article about how he tried to, first he got rid of a lot of independent scientists, then he brought in corporate scientists, and then he tried to set up debates between corporate scientists and independent scientists about the veracity of climate change. And it's kind of bizarre that in 2017, the EPA has debates about climate change when, it's a pretty well-established fact at this point.
I think so. You have to also consider that the majority of the time that the EPA has been dealing with this, that was Obama's EPA, right?
Yeah.
Now we're talking about Trump's EPA. Anyway, I won't say anymore.
Yeah. So there's your critics usually, what they say, there's 3 points that are brought up, and we touched on, I think, a lot of these points. So, A, you never shared your data. B, you used a backdoor to get your study published in PNAS. C, you manipulated your data to get the results that you wanted. Can you?
So first off, the first point is nonsense. The EPA, as I said, had all of my data, still has all of my data. Tom Steger not only has all of the data. So at one point, the EPA said, we want to reanalyze your slides. And I remember, because I think they thought I was bullshitting. And I said, okay, come pick up all the slides you want. And, we walk into a room, because I told them there are tens of thousands of slides. And I said, you can take any of them you want. In fact, Syngenta, I packed up and shipped all the animals from our study back to them at Texas Tech. And I said, here are the animals. You can redissect them and reanalyze the data all you want. And the EPA knew that I did this. So that's just nonsense. And the statement that Ann Lindsay made was obviously written by Syngenta. And in fact, it doesn't hold credibility, because they talk about how their independent statistician supposedly found errors in my data. How could they find errors in my data if they didn't have the data, if they didn't have the raw data? So they've had it. They own it, in fact. So that's nonsense. This business about PNAS is also nonsense. So I watched the video that you sent. It's nonsense. PNAS, let me talk about PNAS first. It's one of the top journals because it's one of the most selective journals for scientific papers, and it's also difficult to get into because it's a general, like Science and Nature and PNAS are reserved for scientific studies that will appeal to the sciences in general. So in other words, if I do something that's only of interest to herpetologists or only of interest to endocrinologists or only of interest to toxicologists, it gets published in a specific journal for that topic. So for something to get published in PNAS or Science or Nature means that it has an appeal to all of the sciences. It's also nonsense, this backdoor thing. At the time that I submitted my paper to PNAS, the procedure was, the only procedure for publishing there was, here's how selective it is. At the time, I couldn't just submit a paper to PNAS. You have to first submit it to a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Okay, so that's how all papers were published in PNAS. So it first had to be accepted by a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and then it went out for review to 3 or more reviewers. I think my paper had 3 reviewers, anonymous reviewers, and then it went to the chief editor of PNAS and had to be approved. That's how every paper got published in PNAS. And that's how my second paper got published. I submitted it to an editor who then accepted the paper and then sent it out for peer review. And there's often there was on my second paper at least, a second peer review, because after you respond to the reviewers, then it gets sent out again for another anonymous review. Okay, so that's all nonsense. You can talk to David Wake, who's the National Academy of Sciences member who submitted my paper. There was no, I watched this video that you sent me. There was no
Miles Power video, which when he has all of his citations on his blog, and if you look at it, that comes from a website. The whole idea that you use the backdoor comes from first of all, the link is dead, and it's called Deniers for Hire. So very ironic. Named websites, and yeah, he also used that to claim that PNAS had to change the way that they accept the studies that they add into the journal. But I don't think he realized that you've published 2 papers in PNAS, one in 2000, I think it was 2002, and then again in 2010 with, I think it was, you talked about how, I don't remember how many scientists you worked with on that 2010 paper where you showed that across vertebrate classes, this has endocrine disrupting effects. So.
I mean, and again, even if that held water, which it doesn't, I also published in Nature, which is published out of London, which is arguably one of the top 2 journals in the world. So what backdoor did I go through to get in Nature? I've also published, I think, 3 papers on this issue in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is run by the National Institutes of Health. So what backdoor that I go through for that one? And so these are all peer-reviewed studies, and it's just it's just complete fabrication. And wait, sorry, what was the third point?
That you manipulated your data to get results that you wanted.
I have no idea where that comes from. I have tens of thousands of data points summarized in those papers, and another paper coming up that has another 10,000 data points in 6 generations, which I suspect is why they're ramping up again and making little documentaries and videos to try to get out ahead of my next series of papers.
Now, there's another thing that your critics often bring up is you did get into an email fight with Syngenta.
Yeah.
And it got very heated, and you were sending them pretty I found it funny, actually, some of the how absurd what you were saying to them was. I read through the whole thing. But do you ever regret that? Because it's so easy for people to use that now to be like, oh, he's unhinged or he's not credible. Look at just how much he lacks decorum for doing this. Or what do you think?
I have had the occasion to, in retrospect, go back now, and sometimes I go back and I read this and I go, oh, what were you thinking? And sometimes I laugh just like you did, and I think there's a couple things that are important here. One is you have to realize, I don't think you can possibly just being in academic science and being in a place like Berkeley, right? You're always under scrutiny. That's your students and your lab is under scrutiny. I don't believe any data that they give me. They have to, we go through all this double blind and color coding and number coding things so that we're objective. And then there's peer review, which is anonymous. And so you're always under scrutiny. And that's stressful. But that's how science is and how science should be. Now, on top of it, you have people who are being paid millions of dollars for the sole purpose of discrediting you, not, questioning whether or not you should have done your experiment this way, whether you interpret it right, but literally just trying to find any way to discredit you, right? So that level of stress, when I think back, it's almost like when you're a little kid and you're being bullied by a crowd, you just start swinging, and you don't necessarily think, I'm going to do this. This is the best thing to do. You just start swinging. So on some level, that's what was going on. On some level, it was comic relief for me.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. On some level, it was, I had a student, Nini Mai, maybe I shouldn't say her name, but Nini Mai, she'd sit next to me when I was writing some of these emails, and she would just go, I dare you. and some of it literally, some of it was, you want crazy? I'll give you crazy. It was a game. Some of it was, if you read through some of their notes, there's this meeting where I met John Giese, and they say Hayes wore sunglasses, kept his coat on the whole time. Hayes asked, is this line clean? But it was a scene. It was a scene from The Matrix. So my student said, I dare you to dress up like, like the main character from The Matrix. And so I did. I met him at Stanford, and I just repeated lines from The Matrix and everything he said. And so, then he write this big analysis over what was he up to? What did he mean? Is this line clean? If you watch if you read that series from Syngenta and you watch the beginning of The Matrix, it's all the same lines, because it was a dare for one of my students. So some of it was a game, and some of it came up because I can't remember now. I said, they played this game. I used to joke that they hired a committee to find out how to scare a Black person, and and then I read their notes with their psychoanalysis, and it turns out it was true. And so again, I sort of played into it. So I did the rhyme thing, and I got told by the Society for Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, like, oh, you can't rhyme when you give a talk. So the next time I showed up, I gave an entire 15-minute talk in rhyme, the whole thing. And so some of it was comic relief and stress relief for me. And you might argue that it may have hurt the case, but also some of it was almost like a handicap principle, saying, look, I can do this and still win. Some of it was, I don't know if there's an old Linkin Park song, and the one of the lines is, all I want to do is be more like me and less like you. And so the more they told me, you can't dress that way, or you can't speak that way, or they would send me emails like, nobody takes you seriously, you're an entertainer, you're a preacher, they would say these things, and I go, okay, well, watch me work. And so the more they told me that I had to be in their arena, the more I forced them to be in mine. You know what I mean? So some of it was, as I said, some of it was just a game. Some of it was just blindly responding. And in some ways it worked. It drew more attention, it drew more drama. And part of the game was, they tried to buy me. And I said, look, you can't buy me. You can't buy my science. You can't buy my words. You can't pay me enough to make me do this. And the control was, I can stop at any time I want. I can decide I don't want to work on atrazine anymore. I was a tenured professor. I can decide I don't want to work on anything anymore. I'm just going to teach. But you have to be involved with me as long as I'm doing what I do. I can stop anytime. You can't stop until I stop. So some of it was flipping that script. And no, I don't think I have regrets.
Okay, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. There was one email that you sent them. I think you sent them a PDF, like Manifesto of a Madman, and you just played into all of that stuff. It's wild. It's really funny, actually.
I tell you, sometimes I read it and I go, "What were you thinking?" And other times I go, "Yeah."
Yeah.
And the idea is, I remember they would say, "You're not professional." I would go, "No, I am a professional." So by definition, I'm professional because I am a professional. So I don't have to operate in your arena. I remember I used to say to them many times, I would say, Jim Carr would say, I don't understand what you mean. I would use some slang or something. I go, well, then you're at a disadvantage because I understand everything that you say. You have to learn how to understand me. I have the upper hand.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, you'd have to imagine that if there was anything significantly wrong with your study. In that Miles Power video, for example, he says that, the EPA said that Tyrone Hayes' study didn't meet the criteria for legitimate scientific work. Well, you'd have to imagine if that was true, which it's not. He just pulled that out of thin air, or he read that on a PR article written by one of Gentris Chills. But you'd have to imagine that they wouldn't put in all this effort to go after you and to try and stack the deck in their favor and manipulate the EPA's risk assessment. And clearly they were scared. Clearly they put a lot of work into discrediting you.
Look, I absolutely, it showed me how good, not me, how good my lab was. Because no study's perfect. You can argue, if I have a sample size of 10,000, you can argue, you should have 11,000. That doesn't mean it's bad. That's just your opinion. And with all, even if it were true that at the first peer-reviewed paper, the first PNAS paper went through the back door, everybody else is now like, man, how did this crap get published? Everybody else should be hard. It should be even harder for me to publish the next study, whether it's in PNAS or Nature or EHP or whatever. And with all those data out there, with all their claims that they don't have the data, you're absolutely right. What did they do? You saw their notes. They wrote down discredit Hayes. They wrote down exploit his father's health problems. They wrote down set a trap. They wrote down consider suing for libel. They wrote all these things down because they couldn't find a problem or hole in the science. And even if that were true with the first paper, you know how many letters I've seen them. You know how many letters they've written to journals trying to have my work retracted with the kind of pressure that a multi-billion-dollar corporation like that has on the university and on the journals? If there were any slight hole anywhere, that work would have been retracted. That work would have been pulled out. I've seen sound studies get pulled out because of pressure. And the funny thing is, I'll say this, maybe I shouldn't say it. The funny thing is, the biggest hole in my work, I just realized this, the biggest hole in my work is when I describe something as a hermaphrodite or a male or a female. That's me. Even if I'm doing it blindly, I define what's a male, what's a female, what's a hermaphrodite. There's no number that comes out of a computer. There's no number that comes out of some fancy machine. It's my eyes that generated the data.
Well, you were looking at it like it's almost microscopic. Like it's really difficult to see the gender. Can you speak more to how you looked at it and found that out?
It was exactly for the way that we figured it out was we were so normally those pictures that you've seen, those animals are fixed in a solution called Boone's that creates the yellow color. Otherwise, the gonads at that stage are transparent. You can't see them. And we were trying to freeze animals so that we could do hormone analysis, which meant we couldn't put them in this Boone's solution. And so I was going through blindly, so I don't know which animals are from which treatments when I analyze them. So I was going through blindly and picking out who's a male, who's a female, and it's literally, as I said, it's transparent. The gonad doesn't show up the way it does in those nice pictures. And to test whether or not I could do that, I would determine the sex of some without that solution, and then we would put in the solution, and I would go back and check later after it turned yellow, like in those photos. And it turns out that with the atrazine treated animals, if they weren't preserved in that yellow color, I was wrong a lot of the time. So then I went back and we started to analyze them and started to realize that they had partial testes, partial ovaries, et cetera. That's how we first discovered it. It's because it was ambiguous with a lot of the atrazine treated animals. And that was when I didn't initially report that to Syngenta. They were supposed to come to that meeting at the university. That's where I was supposed to report it. But when they brought, the statistician and all this bullshit, I didn't share those data with them too much later. Well, until it was published, they didn't know about it.
Because they could have just held on to it and.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's just so many stories of other scientists who go through pretty much like almost the same thing. It's I think about the concussion guy who,
Yeah.
with the NFL. And it seems like any single time that a scientist finds out that there's adverse effects to their product, well, they're just going to deny, and they're going to not really fight with science, but instead with PR. And,
Yeah.
there's a whole industry that helps them do that, the product defense industry. I think that's one of the things that really, I guess I was a bit naive as well, because I felt really disillusioned with any kind of institution, and being able to trust that they actually have the interests of people or the environment in mind. But it just seems like, no, it just doesn't function that way.
Well, and that's what surprised me too. There were people that I liked. Alan Hosmer, unfortunately, I learned recently he's passed away. With Syngenta, I liked him as a person, and I knew he had kids. Tom Steger, the EPA, I think, he really wanted things to work out. He wanted us all to be friends and work it out. And I knew that he had kids. And so in my mind, I'm like, how can you, because Alan Hosmer knew. He knew. I mean, he might have worked for the company, but he knew that we were right, that my lab was right. Tom Steger, he knew. I had long discussions and including emails that I would never share, because it's on some level we were friends. Okay, they knew. And so for me, I think, how can you have kids? How can you continue to support putting something into the environment that it's maybe it won't impact your kids, because maybe you live in a nice house with a Brita water a filter on your water, but on some level it's affecting somebody else's kids. And that's what I couldn't understand. I don't care how much money, and trust me, you have to realize too, when I first started working for Syngenta, I was fresh out of graduate school. My wife was going back to graduate school. I had a kid. I had another kid on the way. I was only paid $38,000 a year when I first started my professorship. Okay. Syngenta, these guys were paying me $1,000 a day. Okay. They were paying me, about 1/40th of my salary per day. If I sent them an email and said, hey, I thought about atrazine today, I would get a check for $1,000. They would fly us off to these fancy meetings, and I get big checks. And there's no amount of money they could have paid me to say something different or to do something different with the data that I had. There's no amount of money. So I can't understand who people like Alan Hosmer and Tom Steger, who I thought were good people. I can't understand what kind of motivation or what would make them continue to deny what they knew was true.
There were certain, I forget exactly who, but there was some of those scientists who were funded by Syngenta who would put out a study saying that there's no adverse effects, there's nothing, no problems here. And then just a couple of years later, I put out a study that shows that there are adverse effects. So, I mean, the pretty blatant hypocrisy. There was one, this is one thing that always stuck out to me about your story that was kind of interesting. There was one Japanese study done in 2007, Oka, I think, et al. And what their lab tried to replicate your study and said that we found nothing. But then just a couple years later, he was one of those scientists on your PNAS paper saying that, across vertebrate classes, there are these effects. Do you think that he was also, I'm not asking you to say for sure or whatever, but is it possible that maybe he was funded by Syngenta, but still said this was an independent study?
I don't know. I mean, I think he was at a private institute, and I don't know. I didn't know Oka, and I don't know him now. We've published together. Tyson Iguchi, who's one of the co-authors on that paper, I've known for a long time. All of my professional life, I've known, but I don't know the details. I know that their original study came out, and they said atrazine had effects, and it affects sex ratio, and it had an effect on the molecular level. In fact, I used to use their data in my talk. Then they had a paper come out where they said, oh, no, there were no effects. And then he came back, as you said, and co-authored with me. And there's a graph in that paper from their studies showing an increase in females in frogs exposed to atrazine. So I can't explain the flip-flop. I don't know him. I don't even know if I've ever spoken to him. You know, all of our interactions might have been over email. But obviously he put his, you know, he co-authored the paper and he agreed with the findings that across vertebrates, we see this effect of atrazine.
Now, what about humans?
You know, there's very strong evidence from their own factory that atrazine increases the risk of prostate cancer. It's also been shown in rats. You know, I often point out in my talks, I study frogs because I like frogs. As I put it, I'm a little boy who likes frogs. I'm pretty sure the people who study rats aren't little boys and girls who like rats. I'm pretty sure that they're studying rats because they tell us something about humans. And in rats, atrazine causes prostate disease, and it's associated with prostate disease in humans. And men who work in their factories, there's an 8.4-fold higher incidence of prostate cancer. Atrazine causes cancer, breast cancer in rats. Atrazine is associated with breast cancer in at least one study of humans. Atrazine causes transgenerational effects and birth defects in rats. And there are multiple studies now showing that atrazine is strongly correlated with birth defects in humans. Atrazine is associated with low sperm count and low fertility in humans, and it's been shown to reduce testosterone in sperm. Atrazine has in fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So, you know, and that's the other thing when it comes down to who's repeated my work. What's even more important is that people I don't know from around the world working in animals as disparate as caiman, you know, it's like an alligator, in rats, in quail, in human cell lines, in trout, in salmon, in fathead minnows, as you mentioned, in xenopus, and toads. All these studies can't be, you know, independent studies can't be wrong.
Yeah.
On these effects of atrazine. And again, when you line all those up, the only studies that say atrazine doesn't do anything are those funded by, in fact, I published a paper where I did a statistical analysis to show that the main predictor of no effect is who paid for the study. And that's still true. I mean, there's dozens of papers have come out since I wrote that paper.
Just to add to what you were just saying, September 9, 2020, wallabies exposed to common weed killer have reproductive abnormalities. So it just seems so it seems bizarre that there still is a controversy here, at least in the way that it's reported and what regulatory agencies are putting out, and it just seems so strange. And you know, I keep getting comments on my videos, people in the UK and different countries being like, "Oh, well, I learned this in my first year biology class. They looked at your study," like, and it just it's very scary how the Syngenta was really able to muddy the water to this day.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, are you familiar with the David Skelly's work?
Yeah, I've known David. Well, I've known who he is. I've known him professionally for quite a while. Yep.
Now, his thing is that he found the hermaphroditic frogs in suburbia, but he says that it's not only caused by atrazine, and actually in different he found much less hermaphroditic frogs in agricultural areas and regions, and he said that it's a mixture of a number of pesticides and chemicals that have these effects. What can you speak to, like, the differences between both of your findings?
I've interacted with Skelly quite a bit. In fact, one of his former graduate students is now a postdoc at Berkeley, and we actually are probably going to collaborate on a big study. So one thing I agree with is, it's not just atrazine. The problem is that atrazine is kind of ubiquitous. So no matter where you go, atrazine is going to be part of the mix. But yeah, I agree. There are other chemicals out there. Ethinyl estradiol from birth control pill is one of those that contaminate. You can find that contaminant out in the environment. And there are potentially, many other pesticides that are estrogenic or that may cause that issue as well. So we agree on that. What I disagree on in Skelly's study is, one, he found lots of hermaphrodites in these sort of backyard ponds. And atrazine is allowed on local lawn use in Connecticut in the areas where he's working. And two, he never measured atrazine. So he can't make the statement that atrazine wasn't part of the problem that he found in Connecticut because he never measured it, right? He collected it, I think he measured caffeine, which has nothing to do with, as a measure of whatever human influence in the water quality, but he never measured atrazine. So he can't make the statement that atrazine didn't do it. Because atrazine is used on lawn in some places, including Connecticut, I believe, he can't make the statement that atrazine wasn't there. So those are my issues. But I agree, even if atrazine's not there, it's not the only thing that would cause potential problems, especially if you're looking in residential areas. We may be talking about ethinyl estradiol, or we may be talking about atrazine that's coming over in the rainwater because we know it travels up to 1,000 kilometers. So having not measured atrazine, he cannot make the claim that atrazine wasn't involved in his particular study.
So when it comes to the veracity of a scientific study, and we've touched on this a lot in this conversation, but how do we know to trust that someone isn't just bullshitting, that someone's not like the guy, the vaccines cause autism guy? Can you just speak to we've touched on it, and I just want to hear your answer. What makes you different than him?
I don't know him personally. I, of course, know the study that you're talking about. I think for me, and we're all human, right? So even if our science is objective, what we choose to study is not objective. Our interpretations are not always objective. But we'd like to think that, and of course, scientists don't have a Hippocratic oath the way MDs do. And even if they did, it doesn't necessarily mean that you follow it. So I think we have to hope and count on the peer review process for getting science published to guard against false claims or false interpretations being published. And I think we have to count on scientists to train upcoming scientists to do work with integrity. That all being said, science is a process. And so there may be times when one thing's interpreted one way and another study will come and negate that, or another scientist will provide a different interpretation. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there was bias or something ill performance in the original data. It was just open to interpretation and then it changed. There's certainly instances of, like you just mentioned, with the autism, where people have just flat out faked things. I think in industry, there's potentially more incentive to fake or fudge or overinterpret data because your job depends on it. That's not true in academia, but there's also the pressure to publish and to, publish something, phenomenal that's going to make your career. So there is that pressure there. I'd like to think that most scientists, certainly most academic scientists, have more integrity than to simply falsify or for example, to selectively publish data that support a hypothesis and leave out data that don't. I don't think that is that common. Obviously, it happens, as you pointed out, but
there's this claim that Syngenta constantly makes that, we did 7,000 independent studies, and they have all verified that atrazine is completely safe when used correctly. And where are those 7,000 studies? Because I looked, I couldn't find them.
I've asked the same. Talk about me, not this claim that I haven't made my data available. I've asked the same thing. Where's that number come from? Where are these studies? Why aren't they available for everybody to review? Right? I mean, yeah. Such a hypocritical thing. I've asked the exact same question. If that's true, where are your data? You're demanding data from me that you already have, but you're making this claim that I've checked, because supposedly you can get anything that they've submitted from the EPA. The EPA doesn't have the studies. They haven't published the studies. I don't know.
It's bizarre. Just it's Orwellian. Like, you look at Syngenta's website, and it says atrazine has no carcinogenic effects, no known carcinogenic effects whatsoever. It has no endocrine disrupting effects. It's not an endocrine disruptor, and they have this whole list right above this banner that's like atrazine is safe for the environment and for families and for your children. And actually, it helps the environment. Like, it's kind of strange, surreal twisting of reality.
Yep.
What do you think of them? They were really able to get farmers on their side when it came to the lobbying for atrazine. There was a lot of I forget which exact farmers group was one of the major ones involved, but I've watched so many interviews with farmers where it's like, it's safe, don't worry, and we need it because
there's two things that strike me about that. One is, I think we have to be clear about what we mean by farmer. So I've seen this in Minnesota where all the farmers show up to the legislative hearing, but farmers, the people who are actually working in the fields and plowing and planting the corn, those aren't the people we're talking about, right? We're talking about big corporate people, and part of the problem is that we have to deal with in the US, I don't know if it's like this all over the world, is that all these seed companies are owned by what used to be 8, which I think is now 6 chemical companies. And so if you're a farmer, you can't afford to speak out against the person that's selling you the seed, the person that like you're counting on. And most of the seed that's grown, it's suicide seed. You can't, it's illegal to save seed, and then, you have to go back to this individual who's also selling you the chemicals. Sometimes the seed comes coated with fungicides. It already comes with the chemical on it. It's difficult to even buy it without the chemical. And the other issue, I've worked with a lot of farmers because I've collected, I've collected on dozens of farms with permission of farmers. And I've had many of them say, because people ask me like, oh, did they give you a hard time? And no, they invite me. I've had many farmers say, anything you can do. We know this stuff is bad, but if I don't use it this year, then my neighbor's going to outgrow me and he'll own my farm next year. And so they're stuck, right? They're essentially owned by these seed companies, which are owned by these pesticide companies. So of course there are many farmers like organic and local and small farmers that will speak out against chemical use, but not these guys that are owned.
Yeah, I see. I'm just, before we come to a close, I'm going to just show you a 5-minute video. It's not the same guy that I showed you last night. This is right on atrazinefacts.com. This comes from the Center for Global Food Issues.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
4-minute clip, Alex Avery.
Yeah, I've interacted with him many times.
I want to see just your reaction to what he says here.
Hi, this is Alex Avery with the Hudson Institute's Center for Global Food Issues. I'm the Director of Research and Education here and have been such for 15 years. My background is in plant physiology and plant science, and for the last 10 years I've been watching very closely the research and the activism of Dr. Tyrone Hayes from the University of California, Berkeley. And for 10 years, Dr. Hayes has tried to claim that atrazine is an imminent threat to amphibian populations because it feminizes frogs at some but not all concentrations, apparently, according to his research, and means that there are more females than fewer males in the wild. And this is a critical threat to amphibian populations, according to Dr. Hayes. The problem is that while Dr. Hayes, whose latest research paper is based on a whopping 80 frogs, only 40 of which were treated with atrazine, is up against a large body of research showing that atrazine has no impact on amphibian development, including several recent papers, one by Oka, another by Cloas, and the Cloas paper looked at more than 3,200 animals and over 100,000 micrographs at multiple atrazine concentrations, and they found no impact on feminization of males or sexual development. And they did all of this with the ever watchful eye of the EPA looking over their shoulder to ensure their experimental design and their protocol would make the research worthy for submission for regulatory approval. And after all of that, they found nothing. So we have an activist researcher who prefers to send out his findings via press release orchestrated by environmental organizations and makes wild, unsubstantiated claims about atrazine's risk to human health via breast cancer, et cetera, or researchers, independent researchers who don't work for chemical companies and who want their research to be taken seriously, who dot all the I's and cross all the T's and show no impact on amphibians. So we have to weigh one or the other. And I don't think Dr. Hayes has really stepped up to the plate. He continues to do research that, according to the EPA, is insufficient and scientifically flawed. The former deputy director of EPA's Office of Pesticides, Dr. Ann Lindsay, testified that Dr. Hayes' data are insufficient, quote unquote, and they found that the other papers he cites are scientifically flawed. And they also complained, going back to the EPA and data submission, said that Dr. Hayes would not share his raw data. Quote, EPA has never seen either the results from any independent investigator published in peer-reviewed scientific journals or the raw data from Dr. Hayes' additional experiments that confirm Dr. Hayes' conclusions. So we have all of that. We have reason to trust one set of data. We have reasons to doubt other data. And my last question to Dr. Hayes is, if atrazine is really the menace that you claim it is, A, why are the frog populations still thriving all throughout the Midwest, even though we've been using atrazine for 50 years? Where is the Frogamageddon you warn about? And two, why is it that Yale University researchers are led by Dr. David Skelly are finding more feminized frogs in urban areas than in rural areas? And they suspect that atrazine isn't the culprit, but in fact human hormones in the wastewater stream are the culprit. So if atrazine is really this menace, A, how come frogs are still thriving 50 years later in atrazine-using areas that have been using atrazine for 50 years? And B, why are the urban areas having a worse problem than the areas, farming areas, where atrazine is most used? Two challenging questions for Dr. Hayes and for those trying to sort out fact from fiction, reality from fantasy. We'll continue to watch this debate. We hope it plays out vigorously in the scientific literature, and eventually we'll come to some sort of reasonable conclusion. I've come to that conclusion, but others need more time, and we'll see how it goes. Signing off from the Hudson Institute, this is Alex Avery.
So what do you think?
Yeah, I think I've actually, wait, let me try to get back to you. I think I've actually seen that one before. And you know, like I said, he's riding on his father's coattails. His father, runs this Hudson Institute, and in fact, in one episode, Syngenta paid him to call me and record the call to try to trip me up, and I don't remember what it was they were trying to get me to say now. So, and he's not a scientist, and he doesn't know the science. He's citing Skelly's work, which, as I said, I have no argument. Of course, ethinyl estradiol and other compounds in the water. Atrazine's not the only thing. And my bigger response is he's uninformed about amphibians. It's very well documented now that 80% of amphibian species are in decline. So to say that frogs are thriving and doing well, it's simply not informed. And I'm not saying they're all in decline because of atrazine or because of pesticides. I published a paper where I talked about the interactive effects of climate change, invasive species, habitat loss, pesticides, emergent disease, and how those all together impact amphibian declines. And even if what he said were true, it'd be like saying HIV is not a problem. I mean, look, there's still people in the world. Or it's like saying COVID's not a problem. There's still people in the world. So just because a chemical or any factor hasn't wiped out all of the species doesn't mean that it's not having a negative impact. Like I said, I know him, and he like this guy Steve Malloy, they don't believe the things that are coming out of their mouth either. They say what they're paid to say. John Inton is another one. He's in Forbes magazine, and he also played one of these. I think Syngenta was paying him. He tried to meet me in the first class lounge of an airport because he wanted to sit down and talk with me and have a conversation and set me up for something. And, and then they're each, and I think this was mentioned in that other documentary, and here's one of the things that drives me crazy, like the New Yorker magazine. I was fact checked up the wazoo.
Yeah.
I had to even prove that my name was Tyrone, And then you have these things in Forbes magazine where they say things that are clearly factually not true. Like I'm a high paid witness for legal groups. Never, zero. Have I ever gotten a dime from any lawyer about atrazine? Zero. In fact, the only person who's paid me specifically to study atrazine, who paid me personally, was Novartis Syngenta and Ecorisk. Period. So
it must be incredibly frustrating. Yeah. I can imagine. It's just even me just looking into this story and just how easy it is for people to watch a video like that and then be like, okay, well, settled. This guy seems confident enough while he's saying that.
Yeah.
Oh, look, there's a controversy here, and clearly that must point to this guy being wrong somehow.
Well, and if it wasn't for their handwritten notes, I look like a complete crazy.
Yeah.
Right? But they wrote the shit down. They wrote it down.
Exactly.
And handed it in to a judge. Who's crazy?
Yeah. It's especially investigate his wife and shit like that. It was
what my father's health problems and I mean, yeah,
it's insane. What can you say about the objectivity of science, and would you call it objective? Would you call your work objective?
I think, let's see. I think that the way that we conduct our work is as objective as you can possibly get. So, for example, you've probably seen in some of my videos, everything's color-coded. So right now, even my graduate students, even students working on a PhD, even if they design the experiment, they don't know which is the placebo, which is the control, and which is the treatment, right? So everything's color-coded, and they have no idea. If I'm involved in the analysis, when the color-coded animals come out of a tank, when they're presented to me, all I have is a specimen number. All I have is number 128. I don't know if it came from the white tank or the black tank or the green tank or whatever. And then once we have all the data, then the students reveal to me which specimen numbers came from which colors, and then I reveal to them which colors were which treatments. So that's objective. So the data that we get are absolutely objective. Now, for nobody is what you decide to study objective. Like I wouldn't think, this chemical probably doesn't do anything, but I'm going to study it anyway. You study things that you think are going to give you a productive result. You study things that you think are going to be interesting. So how you choose and this is why, this is an unrelated issue, but that's important to me. This is why diversity in science is important. This is why there's, for example, a health disparity in among Black Americans. Blacks are more likely to die from those cancers. But part of the reason why it's not studied so much is because if that hasn't been that experience in your life, it maybe doesn't matter to you, right? So what we study is affected by, I study frogs because I had a very positive experience with frogs growing up in South Carolina. So that's not objective, right? Mm-hmm. So what I decide to study is that how I do the study is very objective by my choice in my laboratory. Now, how you interpret results, that's maybe not objective, right? But it's a difference between trying to use your results to persuade or to make a point in one direction and simply making up results like the autism study that you mentioned. That's a whole different thing. Mm-hmm. Right? So let's take David Skelly's study. He didn't study atrazine, but he's deciding that he's going to speak about atrazine in his study. That's obviously not objective, right? So if you blanket look at his study, he looked at frogs in urban areas and agriculture areas, and he measured caffeine. He didn't do anything. He didn't look at atrazine use. He didn't ask the people on their lawns if they were using atrazine. He didn't ask the farmers if they were using atrazine. So how can he say anything about atrazine in his study? His study had nothing to do with atrazine, other than he was interested in my work, and he had been on the EPA panel and wanted to say something about atrazine. That's his interpretation. But his study had nothing to do with atrazine. Zero. I don't know if you've seen it directly, but zero. He didn't measure it. He didn't estimate it. He didn't ask if it was being used. Nothing. So how can you do a study that had nothing to do with atrazine and then make statements about atrazine? So that part is not objective. His study was objective, but how he interpreted and how he used his data and his study were not.
Well, I want to thank you so much for agreeing to sit down and talk with me. This has been very, very interesting and answered a lot of questions I've had for months. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I hope that, more comes out to the point where this is just straight up fact, and anybody who denies it just seems like they didn't really do their due diligence at all.
To say the least.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that it because of financial interests and all of these conflicts of interest that it just diluted the whole, thing. Really unfortunate. I feel like if you studied something that had nothing to do with a company and their product, then there wouldn't be a controversy, but
this is true.
So I wish you the best of luck and continuing to fight the good fight and put reality out there. And yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much as well.
I'm glad we caught up.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Take care.
All right.
See ya. Bye.